This is Talking Drupal, a weekly chat about web design and development from a group of people with one thing in common. We love Drupal. This is episode 381, A Modular Web with Sam Bhagwat. Welcome to Talking Drupal. Today we're talking about the modular web with Sam Bhagwat. Sam's is Gatsby co-founder and chief strategy officer. He's a programmer, analyst, and author of the Modular Web's new architecture. Sam, welcome to the show, and thank you for joining us.
Great to have you. Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Listeners, you may or may not know this. I'm John Picozzi, solutions architect at EPAM, and today my co-hosts are, as usual, Nick Laughlin, founder at Enlightened Development.
Happy New Year. Glad to be back and glad to be talking about, architecture again.
It is a new year, and we're bringing in an old friend joining us for the next 4 weeks, returning guest host, Stephen Cross. Stephen, how are you?
I'm very good. Glad to be here.
Stephen is the founder of this podcast, as some of you may know. He's been a past host, as we noted, and he is a Linux and Raspberry Pi enthusiast. So happy to have Stephen, and looking forward to the next 4 weeks. Jumping into our show, we have Jen to tell us about the experience at Nerd Summit.
Hi, my name is Jen. Are you a nerd? Yep, me too. And I want to make sure you know about Nerd Summit, an inclusive community building tech event held each March here in New England. I work in software development, but I'm actually not a developer. And what I really love about Nerd Summit is the wide variety of professions and experience levels that are represented. I don't have a formal development education, but I really felt comfortable enough at the summit to give my first ever tech-related presentation at a Nerd Summit a couple years ago, and I had a really good experience. For the March 2023 Nerd Summit, the squad of volunteer summit organizers have booked the venue, which is UMass Amherst, picked out yummy lunch menus, and have scheduled 2 really cool keynotes, but we still need more content. Nerd Summit content consists of sessions that are presented by nerds just like you. Proposals for sessions are being accepted now through January 15th, and first-time presenters are definitely welcome. The types of sessions you can propose are talks, panels, and group discussions, and can be on any number of topics, including, but not at all limited to, WordPress, Drupal, programming, design, project management, hardware, maker projects, and so much more. Visit nerdsummit.org, that's nerdsummit.org, for more information and to sign up for our Slack and newsletter. Submit your session proposal now, and then join us at Nerd Summit at UMass Amherst in Amherst, Massachusetts, March 17th through 19th in 2023. Nerd Summit is a great place to share your passions with other nerds. So come show your passion and share your knowledge. Check us out at nerdsummit.org.
Jen, thank you for that. Looking forward to Nerd Summit in Western Mass. And now let's talk about our module of the week. Let's bring in Martin Anderson-Klutz, a senior solutions engineer at Acquia and maintainer of a number of Drupal modules of his own. Martin, what do you have for us this week?
Thanks, John. I thought this week, since the topic of the show is Gatsby, it would be great to talk about decoupled interface translations, which really allows a headless application like Gatsby to use Drupal managed interface translations. So the module was created a little over 2 years ago, but it actually had its first alpha release back in October of 2022. Actually has no open issues currently, and currently is in use by 11 sites, according to Drupal.org. I actually signed on as a maintainer last year because I've been involved in more and more headless conversations. And really the way the module works is it provides an API endpoint for headless applications to send strings for translations or overrides. And then it has another API endpoint to basically fetch all translations at once. And really it creates the ability to manage and translate interface text in a way that I think is kind of a differentiator in the headless CMS space. So it gives Drupal an advantage there because that really has been sort of a robust capability for Drupal for a long time. And again, specifically talking about Gatsby, there's actually a plugin called Gatsby Plugin Drupal IET Next that allows Gatsby to use this very effectively as part of its templates. And I believe you can actually see that in use as part of the headless Umami demo that you can find online. So with that, maybe open it up. Anybody have any thoughts about decoupled interface translations?
I guess it's less of a thought, more of a question, right? So one use case I see for this, right, is like some text on the front end that is like, oh, static button text or something like that. I'm assuming you can send that to Drupal, have it be translated and get it back out for your front end.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's one of the things that's really powerful is in a lot of sort of headless application situations, it becomes very developer focused in terms of, those kinds of small bits of incidental text actually require a developer to go in and update those if the marketing department wants to change it for whatever reason. Whereas this kind of a solution allows for the marketer to be able to manage a lot of that text directly within the CMS and really allows the developers to kind of focus their work elsewhere.
So this is completely out of left field sort of question, but I'm wondering, like, Drupal has like the T function, right? Like everything you want to do needs to be wrapped in a T in order to be translated. Does this suggest or provide any sort of the same sort of function for your front end? Like, hey, wrap it in a Drupal T thingamajigger. And
that's exactly the concept. So essentially it's taking that sort of T function and even the ability to use that within Twig templates and sort of the coupled architecture for Drupal, and really allow sort of, a Gatsby or even, Next.js application to be able to do something very similar within its own templates.
Well, Martin, thank you for solving a problem that I'm going to have this year. Before I even knew I was going to have it. So,
Great module developers do that.
That is true. We've all translated stuff, and and now we're doing it in a decoupled or headless architecture. So this is definitely very, very useful module. Martin, thank you as always. Let's move on to our primary topic. So before we dive into talking specifically about the modular web, let's touch a bit on Gatsby and its history. We've had two previous shows about Gatsby and Drupal, 224 and 260. And Shane Thomas, a senior product manager at Gatsby, has been a guest and a guest host on the show many times. Matter of fact, Shane will be back at the end of February to talk about Valhalla, which is a new product from Gatsby. Well, our listeners, I feel, are probably pretty familiar with Gatsby at this point. How would you describe it to someone that isn't familiar with it?
Yeah, so I talk about I talk about how a lot of websites are going headless or modular, and we're trying to build a front end in JavaScript. When you're doing that, a lot of the functionality that we're used to from our kind of full stack CMS days with tightly integrated templates and the CMS backend needs to be kind of reinvented, and so Gatsby makes that process. It provides a lot of the same kind of base building blocks that you'd be used to. Makes it easy to bring your data in to build a front end with React, and also provides performance primitives to make the whole resulting site very fast. That's a pretty fair starting spot.
So can you give us a little bit of history about how you got involved with Gatsby and how it got started? And in particular, one of the things I'm always interested in with founders or co-founders is, what was the first thing you saw out in the wild with Gatsby that made you kind of realize, oh, this might have legs, this might go somewhere? What was the first project you were like, I never thought that they would do it do this with Gatsby?
Yeah, so Gatsby was started in 2015 as a open source, just as an open source project, really for building your website with React. And so the first person to work on it was my best friend, my co-founder, Kyle Matthews. And Kyle had actually come from the Drupal world, the Drupal community. So he'd done a Drupal startup, he'd been a Drupal developer, he was an early engineer at Pantheon, a Drupal hosting startup. And then he sort of moved from the Drupal world around circa 2011 into the JavaScript world. And then kind of like around 2015 is we were both kind of like watching the rise of React, and it was one of this kind of like holy crap moments where the JavaScript world had been moving towards a more framework driven method of development, as opposed to just kind of more, basic kind of jQuery stuff. But React was kind of the first thing that just kind of captured a certain ethos because of the component-based nature of it. And it was kind of clear, if you looked at it and squinted at it the right way, that it was a lot easier to write things in JSX with one file than having an HTML file and a CSS file and a JavaScript file just to kind of get started. And that sort of the component-driven world reduced a lot of the incidental complexity around web development. And so really when that kind of started taking off, I think, so that was when Kyle decided, like, hey, I want to build a website, but I don't want to build it in Drupal, and I don't want to build it in just vanilla JavaScript. I want to build it in React, and there's no framework to do that. So I'm going to make a framework to do that. And so then, like, first it was his site, then a lot of other folks were sort of contributing sites. But in 2016, React was really taking off in San Francisco, and there were sort of thousands of React developers that came to a React conference, and there was on a talk on Gatsby. There was kind of a, hey, so who's using Gatsby? And like kind of a quarter of the people raised their hands, and it was this like holy crap moment where you could just see hundreds of people in the audience, and everyone wanted to build their personal website on Gatsby. There's been I'll say there's obviously been 6 years since that moment, and a lot of things have happened since then. But that was the first moment where you could just kind of see the raw energy and excitement around React, and also around Gatsby.
Cool.
So in September, you published a book, Modular, the web's new architecture and how it's changing online business, which we've all read. The three of us have read before this,
Okay.
in preparing for today.
That's great.
And I actually said to the guys, I think it's a quick read. Anyone interested? But I think it's kind of an important one. I like how it gives sort of a history of web development and how we've ended up where we are today and where we're going. I think that's a pretty good summary of the book. But I'm interested to know what compelled you to write a book at this point in your career, and who is the intended audience for it?
That's first off, that's great. I'm glad. That's thank you for the compliment. I'm glad that I'm glad you had that experience reading it, and I think you captured exactly what I was kind of trying to get at, which is, how did we get here? Which is hard to answer without this, where have we been, and also a little bit of like where we might be going. And I'd say that, roughly speaking, the intended audience is you guys, right? Experienced CMS developers, tech leads, architects, especially like, solutions architects whose job is kind of telling the client and the customer, okay, here's where you are, and here's some paths for where we think you should probably be going. And I intentionally wrote it. One thing I'll say is I intentionally wrote this as a business book rather than as a technical book. The fact that there weren't sort of code snippets and there was intentional, because I wanted to make sure that while the primary audience might be the solutions engineer, the architect, or it could also be the director of marketing could also read it, right? The project lead could also read it. And there could be the designer could also read it. And there could be a conversation between the different folks on a team of, oh, okay, so is our project more like this example project in the book, or is it the Little Caesars project, or is it, maybe more like that project, right? And so and be able to just have that conversation about what the right architecture is together.
So when did you decide to start writing the book? Was this, and how long was that process?
It took about 9 months, front to back. Um, uh, the the inspiration was that there were a number of conversations. So at Gatsby, we work with a lot of different companies and agencies who are trying to embrace the new modular world, but they aren't always sure how to do that. And so they have questions about what the right CMS setup might be, and what the right front end setup might be, and what the right analytics setup might be, and what their right marketing workflow is. And a lot of times they end up coming to us with these questions of like, we want to go in this direction, but we're not quite sure how. We're not quite sure what the framework should be, what the hosting should be, and all these things. And so we end up having a lot of these conversations, and they end up being very multi-stakeholder conversations. I'm sure each of you in your roles have probably had some of these conversations as well. And the marketer has these sets of questions, and the design team has these sets of questions, and the development team has these sets of questions, and the tech lead and architect might have another set of questions, right? And people want answers that they feel like they can all wrap their arms around. And what I found was that there were different threads of conversation that were really geared to kind of each of the different people, depending on what they knew. Maybe folks coming from an e-commerce background might have some sets of questions. Folks coming from a Drupal background might have another set of questions. Folks coming from more of like a React background, but not as familiar with the CMS world, they had a different set of questions, right? And there were all these different threads that were kind of outlined in the book, from the kind of front end performance optimization to React and the JavaScript world, to the Jamstack, to e-commerce, to the explosion of cloud computing and the startup kind of ecosystem in general, and just the vendor explosion really in the space. What all the different concerns were, from auth and analytics to search and CMS and preview and hosting and all these different things. And so we found that many of the high level conversations were very similar to each other. And we found that we were having some of these conversations, felt like over and over again. And at one point we kind of just sat around a table, and kind of, virtual table, because Zoom and remote work and everything. And we're a fully distributed company, but we sat around a virtual table, and we kind of asked ourselves, well, should we be writing a book here or something, right? And I think we kind of scratched our head on that for a while, and finally we're like, let's just do it. Let's write a book. And so then that kind of started the process, and you guys see the output.
It's like a primer. Like, before we sit down and have a conversation about this, here, read this book first. And when you're done reading it,
I feel like some real old school developer, like RTFM guys, RTFM.
Well, it's funny you just said that, Stephen. It reminded me of Paul Boag wrote a book a while back about like understanding like a web project, right? And like what you should expect out of like starting a web project or trying to scope a web project. And like this is kind of that for the modular web, right? One thing that really stood out to me, and I think Stephen alluded to this a little bit, were like when you see a book like this, right? At least for me, sometimes, and you see that the person that wrote it is a founder of an organization that, like, obviously the book or the organization has skin in the game of the topic of the book, right? You kind of worry like, this is going to be like a sales pitch as to how great they are and why I should use their thing, right? I think what you did a great job of here with the book was, one, bringing in a ton of case studies from various different aspects of the modular web. You talked about e-commerce a little bit there. That was one that I found pretty interesting. But you also brought in a bunch of different technologies and platforms as well, because, you know, as we'll talk about, you know, I think the modular web spans quite a few different companies, and you know, obviously Drupal is making a name as one of the CMSs in that space. So as you go through the book, right, it kind of starts with the history of web development and kind of chunks it out by decades, if you will, starting from like handcrafted HTML, or as I like to call it, the good old days. And goes straight through, you know, content management systems, which, you know, we're all familiar with today, and then talks more about, you know, kind of platforms and you know, CMS as a service and that sort of thing. My question here is, what key technology changes do you think have impacted, you know, web development over the past 30 years, and you know, how has that kind of influenced the modular web?
Over the last 30 years, I would say, I mean, certainly over the last 10, the clearest sort of, if you had to pick one technology that changed things, it was the cloud, right? Because suddenly you can have these miniaturized, pluggable, different component pieces. And I think, you know, we see kind of, I mean, we know that it's often easier to have a single purpose module that does like one thing really well than sort of like a big kind of ungainly module that tries to do 5 different things sort of okay. And the cloud really enabled that sort of like, oh, hey, here's a really good search primitive. Here's some really like solid, you know, analytics primitives. Here's some framework primitives, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Here's some headless CMS primitives, right? And I think that the cloud and SaaS enabled that over the last 10 years. And that was kind of one of the big explosions. And what we're seeing in terms of the ways our architecture is changing is a lot of the what sort of falls out from that explosion of
Yeah,
cloud-based services.
like API first kind of comes to mind, right? And that's growing in popularity. It's funny, and I'm interested to hear what you have your thoughts about this, because I'm sure you have thoughts, as you know, the popularity of like JS frameworks, right? And how that's kind of shaped the way that we build websites now, right? So like, if you think, I don't know, maybe it was like 10 years ago, maybe it was a little longer, maybe it was a little less, but like, people were always like, JavaScript, oh, that's just for like adding functionality to your front ends, right? Like you need to do a pop-up here, use some JavaScript, right? And now it's like, you know, we're using React, we're using Angular, we're using all of these, you know, front end frameworks to basically build our websites, and we're finding, hey, it's faster, and hey, it's easier because we can plug and play a bunch of different services. Like, I got to feel like that's probably a pretty big shift, right?
Yeah. If I had to, I think that's, I would call that out as probably the number 2 aspect. I mean, look, you know, that perception was like fairly accurate, you know, 10 years ago, right? JavaScript spent a lot of the 2000s in the wilderness. Not a lot of progress, not a lot of the problems just kind of lingered and lingered and lingered. And it, you know, they might very well have lingered, but then sort of the JavaScript on the on sort of the TC39 level kind of got their act together, with ES5, ES6, and then there was an explosion of, you know, things from the community, whether that was like Node for server side, whether that was like NPM for package management, and then, you know, whether that was figuring out, or still honestly figuring out some of the module federation stuff, but a lot of the explosion of functionality, and there's a graph, and there's sort of a chart in the book of NPM modules versus sort of, you know, PHP or Java. And obviously, you know, number of modules that's always a good, you know, isn't the best proxy, but it is an interesting proxy that sort of around 2015, you kind of saw the number of JavaScript modules just sort of like, you know, skyrocket past all the other languages, kind of never to look back. And now I think it's 2 or 3 orders of magnitude higher, because with the kind of the explosion of these packages, there you do end up with a ton of functionality there that makes, folks' lives a lot easier. And then on the, obviously on the high end, like things like Angular, React, that sort of Vue that kind of tie all that provide sort of an abstraction layer. And then, Gatsby on top, Gatsby and other frameworks on top of that.
Yeah.
So circling back to the book for a second, for those that haven't read the book yet, for our listeners that haven't read the book yet, can you define what the modular web is for them?
Yeah, that's a surprisingly difficult question. But the short version I would say is that the modular web is a new architecture for the web where websites are made up of a number of these different, these different cloud-based services integrated together, with the CMS as one of those, the CMS as one of those pieces, sort of well integrated with a number of the other ones. Um, but and the architecture being a number of different pieces integrated together, as opposed to sort of a more of a monolithic structure.
So
And yeah.
To kind of flip that question on its head, because one of the things I sometimes find helpful when I'm trying to define something myself, especially something particularly hard like this, is defining it by what it isn't. So what is, if you're looking at a website or a web project or something, what's something that it does that tells you this is not modular?
So if the CMS, if the front end is provided by the CMS, if you're using Twig templates, or if you're using Shopify Liquid framework, or if you're using WordPress template, if you're using the WordPress templates, then it is not. Then I would say it is not a modular framework.
Okay, so when you're saying a modular web, you're specifically talking, you're not just talking about modular like component design pieces and functionality. You're also talking about the bigger things. Like in the book, you talk about Auth0 for authentication. You talk about Drupal or WordPress or Contentful for content management stuff, and you talk about a lot of different, forget the term you use, but a lot of the marketing tools for like helping see what users are doing throughout your website, that kind of stuff. So you're talking about like, critical functional pieces of the website being managed by separate services, whether they're open source or paid services, right?
Yes.
Yeah, like going back to the previous question, right? Talking about like technology changes in the last 30 years. I think like that was another thing that kind of like was clear to me, right? And we talked about like an API first approach, but also like, software platform as a service, where like now you have, instead of having like one thing, right? Drupal, like doing your front end and pulling in content from your PIM system and pulling in content from, all these other services. You now have the ability to kind of do that directly on the front end, right? So it's letting those services kind of manage the data and manage what they do best, and provide that to a kind of unified front end in most cases.
I think you guys are. I love both of those definitions, John and Nick. I think you've laid it out probably more clearly than I just than my attempt earlier.
Well, hey, it's probably thanks to reading your book and really being able to understand the whole landscape out there.
Yeah.
One of the things you wrote at the beginning of your book was the goal was to be able to describe what successful modular web architecture looks like. So
Yep.
could you describe that now for us?
So I'd say that, right. So I defined it maybe in three different success metrics. And the three different success metrics I'd kind of tied to the three different stakeholders of any website, broadly speaking, which are developers, marketers, and users, right? From a user perspective, one of the questions I'd ask is, is this accessible? Is this, performant? Does it have a good kind of content hierarchy or information architecture where it's easy for the user to accomplish the task that they kind of came there to do, right? From often these things also advance developer and marketer goals as well, right? well-navigatable website typically tends to be good for conversions, which is a marketer framework. But from a marketing framework, from a marketer perspective, look at like things like conversion, bounce rate, these types of metrics, and obviously the particular metric is going to be a little bit dependent on the business. But then also there's marketers kind of break down into the demand gen folks, as well as like the content marketer types. And so then you'd also be thinking a lot about what's the content workflow like? How easy is it to edit content, to add new content, to delete content, to manage content, right? How long does it take from when you hit sort of like publish to when you see the content live on the site, right? Because content editors have the same sort of like loop of work that we do as developers, where you want to kind of see that the thing you did worked before you like go on and work on the next thing. And so if you can do that in 10-15 seconds, then you kind of do that well. If it takes 2 minutes or 3 minutes or 4 minutes or 5 minutes or longer, that breaks the sort of the workflow, and it slows down marketers a lot, right? Reduces their productivity. From a developer standpoint, you kind of look at like, hey, is this easy to kind of edit and manage? Can I onboard new developers onto this team who are, first off, is it easy for my existing team to work on? Like, do they understand the JavaScripts or what frameworks or libraries that we're using here typically? And then it would also ask kind of like, hey, does this scale? Like, can I hire junior developers fairly easily who maybe just know React, right? And they can then learn the rest of the stack kind of fairly easily. And then, just developer productivity metrics in general, which usually boil down to like, does the team feel like they can ship things quickly? They understand the code base. Like, how happy are they? It's a little bit of maybe the most subjective metric, but how happy is the dev team working in this stack and framework, right? So user metrics, marketer metrics, and developer metrics are kind of the three big ones.
So one of the things that I kind of thought about while I was going through this project too is how granular the modular web kind of gets. So for example, we've kind of defined it loosely as like a collection of different services to do whatever they do really well. Algolia for search and Auth0 for authentication, right? But I also have a lot of clients that are still keeping a lot of that functionality internal, but they're breaking them up into like a serverless architecture where each piece is a module in their system. Would you consider that a modular web, or is that still in your mind kind of just a monolith if they're not using other services?
I think it depends a little bit on the architecture, and how. I guess I'd call it sort of semi-modular, if that's the word. Maybe we just made that word up right now. What it is that I'm kind of curious a little bit of like the rationale or justification for why clients are doing that. But it seems to accomplish some of the ends, which is sort of decoupling, but without some of the other ends, which is maybe you don't even need to, maybe there's like just less auth code to maintain, entirely.
Yeah, I mean, I can briefly, some of the rationale is a lot of it is for the same benefits. If you have modular code, or if you have code serving just small API specific sections, you can have different teams. You can move people around different teams. Different teams are responsible. If you need to update one particular thing to Node 16, for example, you don't have to worry about upgrading everything. But sometimes, sometimes there are Auth0 really is kind of an exception, because even on this project they're using Auth0. But a lot of times, these SaaS products, maybe they don't fit your use case perfectly. So you do something similar, but being able to control that yourself gives you a lot more flexibility. So sometimes it's cheaper for a startup to like build a small bare bones kind of modular piece of functionality than it is to just use a service that they're not sure how it might scale with their costs.
I don't know if I necessarily agree with that, but we'll hear what Sam has to say, because he's the expert.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's dependent on a lot of kind of factors. One thing I'll say is that on the extreme end, if we reround the clock right now back to 2008 or 2010, maybe, I think a lot of folks were like, hey, I'm going to build a CMS. Like, we've got this client project, and like it just doesn't feel like any of these existing CMSs like do what I need, and I'm going to build a CMS. And I think we can all agree that those days are over, right? The CMS landscape is like good and mature enough that like you should not be building a CMS these days. That said, like that's not, and over time that like that same process happens with every kind of piece of the architecture. And I'll kind of hold up a picture from my book, which is kind of the modular web solar system. I think it's getting a little bit washed out, but there's a lot of different pieces, and they all mature at different speeds. And so
Right.
it could be that you are that like particular piece that you're thinking about really doesn't map well to your use case. I think over time that will probably happen sort of like less. And for even for folks that maybe need like an on-prem kind of like solution, more and more open source libraries are popping up that do auth, for example. And so you can start with a super tokens for auth, or if you want to do an open source e-commerce, maybe you start with like a Medusa for e-commerce, and then like maybe you need to build some functionality on top of that. But finding like an open source project that does most of what you want to do, and then like maybe adding or augmenting there, rather than say we're just going to think about auth and reinvent auth from scratch, all ourselves.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I agree with that 100%. It's funny. It like harkens back to like an interview question that I would always ask folks when I was interviewing them, specifically about module development. Like, hey, if there's a module that does 80% of what you need it to do, and you can code the last 20%, or you need to build your own, what are you going to do? And the guys that would say like, oh, I just build my own because then I know it, I'd be like, I don't know, guys. Like there's a lot of maintenance and overhead there, right? Like you get 80% of it. You may realize that maybe that last 20, you only actually need to do 10% because there's 10% in there that wasn't really a really hard requirement. But I think that's where the modular web comes in. And, to Nick's point previously, he was talking about like, sometimes the services don't do 100% of what they need to do, but I would still say like you're better off, in my opinion, using the service, right, for the 75 or 80% of the things it does well and that are useful, right, and then building middleware in there to kind of like handle the things that it doesn't need to do, or modify the data if it needs to be modified, right. And that's kind of where, bringing it back to Drupal for a minute, because it is a Drupal podcast after all. I feel like Drupal is really good glue for a lot of those systems where you may not necessarily want to store the data in Drupal. You may not want to enter the data in Drupal, or even really manipulate the data in Drupal, right? But like it can interact and be the glue for your front end and those third-party systems where you have that opportunity to manipulate if need be. But also bring in that data and have that data interact in a safe space, if you will.
And I think it's interesting, since we're on a Drupal podcast, that a lot of Drupal has a lot of this functionality kind of built in its third-party libraries, and in some ways a lot of the modular web is sort of saying like, hey, would you consider using a third-party service instead of this particular service for Drupal? Because as good as the service might be, maybe we should build a service that can be usable by the entire web. And so there's just going to be kind of like more dev infrastructure to work on than just kind of having to amortize. And I'm going to, out myself as like an econ major here, but like amortize the cost of like the development of that like infrastructure. Let's amortize that over the entire web rather than just the Drupal community. And so I think like you could say a lot of cloud computing is basically that sort of idea. And that's a lot of the sort of the scale efficiencies that got unlocked in the cloud computing revolution. It's kind of by aggregating these different communities together.
Yeah, I mean, Drupal really has. That's another way of saying in the Drupal world, we kind of call that get off the island, right? Starting about 5 or 6 years ago, Drupal started using Symfony under the hood, right? And it's the same kind of thing. Like a lot of different CMSs use Symfony, and Symfony handles a lot of stuff like session management and stuff that Drupal had already previously solved, right? But maintaining that themselves rather than just contributing back to Symfony, and then also gaining things that Laravel, for example, might contribute back, or Silverstripe might contribute back, and security. Like you don't have to. It's not like, hey, this security thing happens and now Drupal, Laravel, and Silverstripe and everybody else has to do it. Symfony updates it, and then everybody just updates their Symfony version, and that security patch is fixed. So I think that's a great way of thinking of it. It's amortizing. It's not just amortizing the server costs, but it's also amortizing, security needs, developer time, and developer time on both sides.
Yeah.
Like the Symfony team has to develop it, but you know how to update Symfony. If you know how to update Symfony, you can fix whatever sites are using Symfony, right? So that's definitely an interesting way. It's probably cleaner than maybe Get Off the Island, but that's been a big initiative in the Drupal world for about 5 or 6 years, I think, is finding ways to utilize that type of functionality.
And I think one other note from what Nick had said earlier is is cost, right? So I think overall, like the modular web can be cheaper or more cost effective for you depending on what you're trying to do, right? Because developer time is expensive, and developing custom things is requires maintenance and upkeep, and all of those things, that cost can be offloaded to those third-party services. Like if you're using Algolia for search as an example, right? There's a lot that they're doing to increase and enhance their product and make their product better that you don't have to worry about. You can just pay a fee, get those services, and run with them, right? So I think that there is cost savings, even though that some of these services are expensive, on the development, maintenance, and security side of things as well.
And to kind of piggyback off of that, one of the reasons that kind of from a practical level, one of the questions that people have once they move to this new architecture is really, great, so I have these modular services now. I have my headless CMS API, right? I have my hosting service. I have my search service, but how do these things kind of integrate together? And so I delve quite a bit in the book in terms of like, here are the workflows that you need to think about once you have moved to this new modular world. For example, if you're using an e-commerce service with a CMS, how does the e-commerce service do all of your e-commerce related needs, or does it maybe store a core set of fields for each SKU, but then you actually need to augment that with with your content team filling in additional SKU information, maybe some custom fields, maybe product variants in the CMS? And if so, how's the data getting from point A to point B? And so you should be thinking about selecting an e-commerce system and a CMS that work well together, from that standpoint, right? If you're so that's one example, and then I could kind of go through other examples. How do you do marketer driven like landing pages, right? How do you have like a content preview workflow? What's your content publish workflow like? But a lot of them and a lot of these things have to do really less with any one individual service, but more with the integration between these different services. The good news is that there's, that there's a small and finite number of these integrations and workflows to think of, on the order of, you can sort of count them on your hand usually for a particular project. And then the other thing is I sort of went through what they are kind of in the book, and how to think about your different options there.
And as indicated by my shirt, for those that can't see it, I'm wearing a Drupal shirt. I think Drupal's a good platform to help with that. I also may be a little bit biased. So let's talk a little bit about like hypothetical here, right? I have, a monolithic sort of website. I'm looking at, moving to kind of a more modular architecture. Sam, what do you think some of the biggest challenges I may face are with that, in that migration?
So I guess like my question for you, would be, why are you moving? Why are you moving to modular architecture in the first place?
This is great. So the reason is because I need I want a fast, headless front end, but I also want my content available to a web app and device that my company is creating.
Okay, that's awesome. So there's kind of it sounds like there's a couple of kind of main reasons. Like some of them are sort of support multiple front ends, and then some are kind of optimize kind of like the web front end, on kind of performance in general. And so I think that the first question I'd have is kind of like, how are you doing things now?
Okay. Let's see. It's monolithic. It's Drupal. It's Twig front end. It's Drupal theming. Drupal all day long.
Okay. So then I think like what I would typically recommend in that sort of situation is start with the most important thing that you want to do first, right? Don't try to say, okay, we're gonna, migrate from Drupal 7 to 8, and at the same time we're gonna do some people are in that situation. Maybe they're Drupal 7 end of life, and they have to do that. They have no other option. But it's a tricky spot to be in, right? We're gonna re-platform onto Drupal 8, and we're gonna launch a new headless website on top of that while still using Drupal 8 to power our mobile app and our billboard and like this stuff. Like that's just a tricky spot to be in. If you can avoid that, take a time. Great. If you can't, like, take a time machine, go back 2 years and make different decisions. Good luck.
Just a quick note for you. It's Drupal 10 now, so you're going Drupal 7 to Drupal 10. But listeners will know.
Yeah. Sorry. Thank you. Yeah.
Maybe you're going to Drupal 10. Who knows?
Yeah. I guess my number one piece of advice would be like pick the most important thing and do that first. So if having the web property be really fast is the most important thing, great. We're going to keep having your Drupal 8, Drupal 9, Drupal 10 installed, power your billboard and your mobile app while we focus on getting a JavaScript based front end up working really fast, and then we can cut over from the Drupal site to the existing site, right? And I think usually like whatever the largest challenge is with this project usually gets a lot smaller when you figure out how to stage and segment it into meaningful, manageable chunks. And there's,
I think I seem to remember Brian Perry having a talk about this a while back when he was with Bounteous, doing like a progressive decoupling. So that kind of sounds like what you're advocating for is like, hey, don't do it all at once unless you like absolutely need to, right? It's like, let's take it into small chunks and like build the API for this thing and then the API for that thing. And then like most of that should be, if you're on Drupal 8, upgradable to Drupal 10 or future versions of Drupal. So
Brian's a smart guy. Like his body of work is really solid. There's a lot of things that go into this. So, for example, has your development team used JavaScript before? Have they used React before? If they have, it's going to be easier. And I actually have in chapter 10, I kind of have a checklist of like, hey, here's how you should be kind of thinking about. Let me see if I can pull it up here, but basically it's sort of like, it's almost like a scoring chart of like, how ready are you for the modular web? It has a lot to do with what industry you're in and what your base kind of team competent skill sets are. How much JavaScript background do they have? Are they excited about learning new things? Are they kind of scared about learning new things? How many are excited versus scared? Are you if you don't have a team, have you hired an agency? Does your agency have competence in this? Do you know how to hire a developer? You have a manager that has good experience and they can hire like React developers or whatever. So I think like when you figure out how to stage the problem right, it's a lot. Stage the problem more simply, then you can tackle these risks sort of sequentially rather than trying to tackle them kind of all in one big go.
So following up on John's use case a little bit, I mean, that kind of leads right into the next question here, which is, how do you think a Drupal team is positioned to move to the modular web and what things should they focus on first? And I think you've touched on a little bit of that in the last few minutes here. But
Hmm.
extending on John's case, where I've got a team that does Twig, is Drupal people. What 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 are the strengths of what they know now, and where should they
Yeah.
focus their learning on?
Yeah. So what we typically tend to see with Drupal folks is that, because Drupal is such a flexible content management solution, it's really like a multi-purpose tool. The development teams that we see relative to other, frameworks tend to be pretty savvy and sophisticated. I mean, if you're sort of like looking at like a Drupal development team versus, someone operating in more of like an e-commerce templated world, I would tend to bet on the Drupal team's general purpose development skills. Knowing nothing else, I would say the Drupal team probably is stronger. And so, stronger and more general purpose developers often find it easier to relax that, or sorry, easier to stretch and learn new things. They're more used to, if you can think about, because Drupal has a flexible content module, they're already used to thinking about, hey, content could just be really any relational structure that could be dreamed up. Drupal can already make it. We as developers have to deal with that. Again, like an e-commerce team might not be used to thinking in that, particular world. So that's I think a definite strength of the Drupal world relative to other frameworks and CMS communities.
So thinking about kind of those developers and companies that are looking to make this leap into a modular model, right? What do you have any recommended, kind of learning tools to help them kind of accelerate their skills to, be ready for this or get ready for this move?
Yeah. I mean, I think the first thing is to just view it more of an agile process than a waterfall process, and I'll give kind of an example. So we've seen a lot of folks in the CPG world, right? And so you've got these like large CPG brands or large CPG sort of conglomerates that own hundreds of brands, and so they have this like portfolio of websites, and they many of them have started thinking we need to move on to the modular world from being a pure play Drupal shop, from other sort of like CMS communities, and when we've seen them, the ones that have done it well, what we've typically seen them do is they'll start with these smaller microsites. Maybe it's a really niche brand that they've got, and do they need to replatform over? No, but they kind of want to just, hey, okay, if we built like this 2-page site, how does it go?
Yeah, lessons
And
learned.
they'll kind of just they'll find some, they'll sort of find some developers that don't just have a project assigned to them for this month, and they'll be like, just take a go at it, and then they'll do this 3 or 4 or 5 times on these little small sites. And so I'd kind of encourage, I'd encourage folks in whatever kind of industry your company or your agency typically plays in, to think about doing that. Don't think about like, oh, we're gonna like, prepare and like, look, if you want to go on, on LinkedIn Learning, or if you want to go on Udemy, or if you want to go and like, find some courses, and like, great, like definitely do that. But even more than that, think about, hey, can we just give a developer a month to like move over the site that like we don't really care about that much, and just kind of see how it goes,
Yeah.
and take their learnings back to the rest of the team.
So CPG means consumer packaged goods, I think, right?
Thank you.
Yeah, okay.
Yes. Yeah.
Because I wasn't familiar with that term. But okay.
Yeah.
So we brought this up a couple times, being a Drupal show. You did mention Drupal a few times in the book. I was happy to see that representation as a Drupal developer myself. And Gatsby
Uh-huh.
itself has pretty deep ties to the Drupal community.
Yep.
But I'm curious, have you ever built a Drupal site? And if you have, when's the last time you kind of worked in Drupal yourself?
I personally haven't. I haven't built a Drupal site. I've kind of, like I've Shane, obviously Shane in our company, and then my co-founder Kyle are very deep in the Drupal world.
Yeah.
So they've kind of walked me through a lot of the nuances, and Drupal is very much one of the early adopter communities of the modular web. So we have a lot of friends in the Drupal world.
So we at the top of the show talked about Shane coming on to talk about Gatsby's new product Valhalla at the end of February. So other than that, what is coming for Gatsby in 2023? What's on the horizon?
I think that's one of the main things that we're thinking about. And I'll kind of give a little bit of a preview maybe for the February episode with Shane, which is Gatsby has a data layer, and it's very unique in terms of modular web sort of front-end JavaScript frameworks, in that it doesn't just kind of hit APIs and bring data. It sort of sucks in the data from the CMSs that it integrates with, and kind of stores that in a Gatsby DB, and then makes that data available for pages and templates to query using GraphQL. And so the folks who use Gatsby always have kind of told us, we love the data layer. It's, a little bit different than the other frameworks do it, but we love how it works because it makes our data management so much easier and simpler. And so we basically thought, well, instead of having this just be exclusive to Gatsby, what if we kind of, in the spirit of the modular web, right, pulled this out and made it actually available as a service to get pulled into not just maybe a Gatsby site, but really into any kind of mobile app, maybe a Next site or a Vue site, or any sort of third-party application that needs to kind of consume data. And so we really see it as like an orchestration layer on top of the different the different data sources. And I think like this is actually a good segue to talk about how the space is. I would say like the interesting things that we see is that in terms of the space in general, right, are that we keep progressing down and crossing the chasm from early adopters to the early majority, and more of these early majority companies are switching on to the modular web and Gatsby. And when that happens, you see companies coming in with 5 CMSs or 10 CMSs, or with these incredibly complex setups with like hundreds of developers and different teams and internal services that may or may not be integrated with each other and various front ends. And you just see more of the kind of complex real world use cases that you might see at a solutions implementer, right? Or at a sort of a larger agency with a Fortune 500 client. And I think that where the space is going, the modular web space broadly in 2023, is that not just Gatsby, we're building Valhalla to sort of like help adapt to this world of where people do need like a content orchestration layer, but really almost everybody from the vendor space and kind of the agency and SI space are thinking about this new world where we just have more complex kinds of projects than we'd had, 2 years ago or 3 or 4 or 5 years ago. And I think that's great because it means that what we're doing is working and it's catching on.
It's funny you think of that like that phrase like doing more with less, right? So it's like we're adding all of this stuff to these projects, but we're trying to do it with, less services, less developer hours, less maintenance, less cost maybe. And it's a fun problem to have, or fun problem to solution for, I guess.
Yeah, it is. Looks to me.
So is your next product would you call it like a content warehouse? Is it?
You could call it that. I mean, we call it more of like an orchestration layer, because we don't sort of it's not Gatsby's data layer integrates with Shopify and integrates with Contentful and it integrates with Drupal and it integrates with WordPress, and integrates with a couple other dozen /100 sources, and so those sources are where those are the kind of the sources of truth. But the Gatsby's data layer, which we're sort of turning into a service, which we've turned into the service Valhalla, is the orchestration layer that sort of says, okay, cool. Now instead of having to hit 5 different APIs or 10 different APIs or 20 different APIs. Actually, we've aggregated that content and actually integrated it in terms of like there might be relationships between different, you know,
Yep.
objects in different systems, and then now we're exposing it to you via an API.
So
And it's also cloud scalable and fast.
yeah, I mean, I saw a brief preview at Shane's presentation at NetCamp and was very impressed. I'm definitely looking forward to that show in February. So I actually have a question for you too that I just added that you might be in a kind of unique position to answer. You know, your title is Chief Strategy Officer, which kind of implies long-term thinking, right?
Hopefully.
And you work at a company, you know, you work at Gatsby, which is in a JavaScript project, and JavaScript is a very, very quickly moving, right? You know, the joke is that there's, you know, been 3 JavaScript frameworks dropped in the time that we've been talking. So one of the questions I have is, you know, when you're looking kind of at the web itself, how are you thinking about it in a way that you can keep Gatsby both as an open source project and, you know, as a company, I guess? How do you think about how you keep it competitive and make sure that it's, you know, relevant and still providing value to people using it? And obviously part of that is releasing new features and orchestration layers, things like that. But
Yeah.
where are you coming up with the ideas to make Valhalla? You know, it's not like yesterday you're like, oh yeah, we need Valhalla, and today it's released. There's a lot of effort internally and stuff that goes into releasing a product like that.
Yeah. So I think there's kind of 2 parts of that, 2 parts of that question, like or 2 answers to that question, which I'll kind of do somewhat sequentially. The first is that in the JavaScript world, it moves incredibly quickly, and one of our, you know, there's almost a base sense of any kind of front end sort of vendor in the job or open source project in the JavaScript world that you need to keep up with the times. So, for example, a couple of years ago, there was a big focus on all the frameworks added support for serverless functions, for example. So serverless functions was just a thing, and like within like 6 months, basically, like Next had it, we had it, Nuxt had it, you know, Aster had it, blah, 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 all the frameworks had it. And it became the current thing. It sort of became like the main character on Twitter, and then you know, it kind of everybody shipped it. You know, then at another period or point in time, it was kind of having something between SSR and SSG. So SSR is server-side rendering, SSG is static site generation. You can think about them as like fully dynamic and fully static. And hey, we need to be between these things that has the advantage of being able to kind of respond quickly, like load quickly for customers, but it also has the dynamic advantages. And so again, sort of everybody had their solution in the space of kind of 6 months. And you know, we call ours kind of there's a number of different things, but we defer DSD for sort of deferred static generation. But then we kind of the overall the overall architecture. We actually started calling it RSG, which is reactive site generation, which is kind of again kind of combines the benefits of this sort of the SSR with SSG, and again, like within a period of like 6 to 12 months, basically every framework kind of and every hosting platform so ship support for their preferred version. And so part of staying kind of competitive in a world that moves as fast as the JavaScript world moves is, you know, keeping up with the Joneses. But the other part of it is deciding what makes you uniquely you, right?
Yeah.
And we went through that journey, you know, a couple of years back where we were like, what do people absolutely love about Gatsby? Why do people absolutely love Gatsby? What is the specific type of person that absolutely loves Gatsby versus the person that doesn't absolutely love Gatsby? And what we realized is that like the Gatsby user base was heavily focused in the structured content world, Drupal certainly, but also people using other CMSs that have like deep structured content use cases. And so we decided that we would be that if you wanted to build something that was like deeply in the structured content world, we would be the best tool for doing that in a decoupled headless way. And then so as a result, a lot of our strategy per se has kind of like fallen out of that. whether that's like, taking Valhalla and sort of like taking your content orchestration layer and turning that into a separate piece, or just, continuing to add support for larger sites, larger site sizes, and so on and so forth.
Makes sense.
So as we come to our last few questions here, Sam, we've talked a lot about your book. Where can people find it first?
You can find it on Amazon. So it's it's a modular, the web's new architecture and how it's changing online business. And you can find it on Amazon if you Google that, or Amazon search that, or if you search my last name, you should find that.
There will be a link in the show notes.
Even
And
better.
I have a publishing technical question for you. So I purchased the book on the Kindle version, and I was unable to read it on my Kindle. Why is that?
The answer is because I have not yet uploaded the new Kindle version that fixes that problem, which I have in my email inbox now, and will upload after the show.
Okay, awesome.
So it should be solved by within time.
All right.
Yeah.
There you go. Well, Sam, thank you for joining us. This has been a super enlightening conversation, and we hope to have you back.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here, and a pleasure to chat with each of you.
So for our listeners, do you have questions or feedback? You can reach out to Talking Drupal on Twitter with the handle Talking Drupal, or by email at show@talkingdrupal.com. You can connect with our hosts and other listeners on Drupal Slack in the Talking Drupal channel.
You can promote your Drupal community event on Talking Drupal. Learn more at talkingdrupal.com/tdpromo. And
you can get the Talking Drupal newsletter for show news, upcoming Drupal camps, local meetups, and much more by signing up for the newsletter at talkingdrupal.com/newsletter.
Thank you, patrons, for supporting Talking Drupal. Your support is greatly appreciated. You can learn more about becoming a patron at talkingdrupal.com and click in the Become a Patron button in the sidebar. All right, we have reached the end of our show. And Sam, if folks wanted to reach out to you about the modular web or learn more about Gatsby, how could they get in contact with you?
So you can reach out to me at sam@gatsbyjs.com. You can also find me on Twitter at CalcSam. That's CALC and then Sam. So at CalcSam. That's my Twitter handle.
Stephen Cross, what about you?
I'm at Stephen Cross with a PH.
There you go. Nick?
I'm at Nixman, NICXVAN, pretty much everywhere.
And I'm John Picozzi. You can find me on all the major social networks and Drupal.org at John Picozzi. And you can find out about EPAM at EPAM.com.
And if you've enjoyed listening, we've enjoyed talking. See you guys next week.
See you.
Thanks, everyone.